welcome to Heart, Soul, Mind, the regular weekly Bible study of St. Paul Lutheran Church in this winter-spring season of 2021 as we continue to study the Bible's big stories in their tellings and their retellings. This week we come to the retellings of the story of exile and restoration. As we come to the end of the time of biblical Israel, exiled to Assyria in the 8th century, exiled to Babylon in the early 6th century. And then a half century later, those Babylonian exilees given the opportunity to restore their society, rebuild their temple under Persian oversight. Because we near the close of biblical Israel's history and testimony, time is sort of compressing. And so the space between the tellings and the retellings, or at least the space between the events told and the retellings, is considerably shorter. We saw in our last session that finding contemporary sources for the telling of exile and restoration is a tricky business, because already these tellings by contemporaries like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, or Ezra and Nehemiah for the restoration, these tellings of the story are already interpretations of what is going on in these writers' own times. Actually, that's been the case all along. The tellings that we have seen of stories going back to the creation and coming through the ancestors and the Exodus and settlement of the land, the kingdoms, all of these tellings that we have seen are not so much contemporary news reports as they are the tellings that became normative, that became biblical, that became the way that the chronological story of biblical Israel and God's work in the world was presented. And then the retellings were other ways of telling and interpreting those same events. I've done my best to make sure that the retellings have in some way in view the canonical, the official biblical telling of the story, but that's not always the case. Sometimes the retellings come at things from a very different perspective, as we saw, for example, with the retelling of creation in Proverbs 8 as a story about wisdom as an architect of creation, something that really doesn't appear in the Genesis accounts of creation. So we realize that when we are working with these biblical tellings and retellings, it's not as though any one of them is more authentically accurate than any other one. We can say that some are more contemporary. Jeremiah and Ezekiel were more contemporary when we looked at them last week with the exile that they were describing than, for example, the later Jewish writers that we'll talk about in a moment. But our retellings are so close to the tellings when we look at the Old Testament retellings this time that we have to keep in mind this phenomenon that telling and retelling is more in the way in which the text is received, the way in which the reader understands it, than it is as a definition of what's accurate and what's interpretation? Well, we also have to realize that as we come to the close of biblical Israel's history, that while we will look at retellings in the New Testament today, there is also a substantial amount of retelling of exile and restoration in Jewish literature. That also has been true throughout our study. We haven't looked at how the Jewish community, both in antiquity and down to the present, may think about creation or ancestors or the like. But with exile and restoration, it's particularly significant because after the first century of the Common Era and this destruction of the Jerusalem temple by the Romans in 70 of the Common Era, the Jewish community understood itself to be in exile once again without a temple, once again driven out of the land for most of 2,000 years, both by edict and by circumstance. So that restoration for the Jewish community is cast very much in terms of the restoration that happened in the middle of the 20th century, from the late 19th century beginning of settlement of the land under the Zionist movement, through the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, and on through the 20th century and into the present, with the return of Jews from exile out around the world to the homeland surrounding Jerusalem, biblical Galilee, Israel, and Judah. There are some in the Jewish community, many in Jewish America, who would say that actually Jewish life in America is not very much like exile in Assyria or in Babylon, or even exile among the nations for the last 2,000 years. They would suggest that Judaism has found a new home in America in a way that the Bible never really quite shows Judaism at home in those places of earlier exile. That's a strong and meaningful debate within the Jewish community that we don't have to address more specifically or resolve in our sessions. Certainly we can discuss them, but we need to be aware of them, because exile, whether one understands oneself to be in exile still, not living in the state of Israel, or whether one thinks of life outside the state of Israel as a new kind of home that is not in exile. Exile continues to be a truly significant category for the Jewish community as they talk about their life and their perspective on the world. Well, all that as a bit of introduction to going back to the retellings of exile and restoration in the Bible as we receive it as Christians. When we look at late biblical Israel's retelling of exile, we see that primarily the question that was asked and the issue that was taken up by these later writers was the question of why. Why were we driven into exile? Ezekiel actually offers two of the classic responses to that, two of the dominant responses to that. First one we read in this R-rated, might we call it, chapter 23 of the prophet Ezekiel, about the two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah, who are both rather wanton with their ways with foreign rulers, foreign armies, foreign gods, foreign culture. And Ezekiel characterizes this, as Hosea had a couple centuries earlier. Ezekiel characterizes this as adultery. Israel is the bride of God, and God has committed God's self to this young woman, Israel. If you look at Ezekiel 16, you'll see some of that background to that imagery as well. But here in Ezekiel 23, recognizing the dual exiles of the northern kingdom Israel and the southern kingdom Judah, Ezekiel talks about these two sisters, Oholah and Oholibah, and characterizes both of them as adulterous, idolatrous, faithless to the God of Israel. And says God through Ezekiel, this is why you have gone into exile, because of your faithlessness. And indeed, in Ezekiel chapter 23, verse 34, God makes it explicit that God has given judgment to Babylon, so that Babylon will exact the punishment, the price, will impose the penalty and the discipline and the learning on Oholibah, the southern kingdom, when Babylon exiles Judah to Mesopotamia. Here we see that it is idolatry that God uses Babylon to punish. In Ezekiel 34, another image emerges, and that is that it is Israel's, Judah's failed shepherds. Now, we've seen before in our study that the shepherd was a characteristic epithet, a characteristic descriptor for talking about kings in the ancient Near East. It goes back as far as the third millennium, 2400 BCE. And it shows up both in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, those two great global cultures that surrounded ancient Canaan and Israel and Judah. The shepherd, presumably emerging from the agricultural and pastoral culture of these ancient Near Eastern kingdoms. The shepherd was a key figure who made sure that the flock found the watering holes and got to the pastures where they could feed. Not that they couldn't do it on their own, but that a good shepherd made that easier for the flock, just as good kings make all kinds of things in life easier for the people who are ruled. And so God looks to kings within Israel and Judah to be good shepherds for God's people. And because those shepherds have failed, they've gotten fat on the sheep themselves, they've exploited them for their own power and benefit, God says he has taken the flock from those shepherds, again, through the mechanism of exile. In the future, God's self be the shepherd of Israel. We see this also in the understanding as it's described in 2 Chronicles 18. And in 2 Chronicles 36, we get yet a third image where Chronicles describes the actual moment of exile from Jerusalem in 586 BCE and describes that as being fundamentally the result of the nation's failure to listen to the prophets of God. Here it's not so much the kings, although they're certainly implicated, but rather it's the failure of the nation to listen to the prophets that's in focus. And 2 Chronicles, looking ahead to restoration, indicates that when that restoration takes place, it will be because God will fulfill the word of Jeremiah that came to Judah in its moment of crisis and decision as to whether to listen to God or not. So again, we see here that over and over again, whether it's because of idolatry, whether it's because of failed kingship, whether it's because of a national failure to listen to prophets and the word of God. The exile is taken on Israel and Judah themselves as being a consequence of their unfaithfulness or of the failure of their leadership or their whole people in relationship to God's will. And those consequences are understood as coming from God. We've wrestled with this in our conversations. Why is it that God would do this? And I hope that it has been helpful to think about this not in terms of why would God do this, but rather to think about it in terms of the reality that exile happened. As we saw in our last session, exile happened in part in our geopolitical analysis. It happened because Babylonia and Egypt were fighting for control over the ancient Near East. And Israel and Judah happened to be right along the pathway in that narrow belt along the Mediterranean where those two great kingdoms would meet and traverse in their battles with each other. So exile happened. And these biblical writers are now asking, what can we learn from this? And how can we have hope for the future? Well, if it's all about what Babylon and Egypt are doing, then the only hope you have is that somehow the power politics in those two great kingdoms will work out in your favor. But what influence do you have there? The biblical writers make the witness that if what has happened through Babylon and Egypt, if God has given judgment into the hands of Babylon, and so what happens because of Babylon's movement is in God's hands, then the hope for your future is also in God's hands. The hope for the future is that when God said through Jeremiah, I will bring you back, that indeed God will bring you back. And if that's through Babylon, it will be because God makes it happen through Babylon. If it's through Egypt, it will be because God makes it happen through Egypt. And as it turns out, when it is through Persia, Isaiah says that Cyrus is anointed by God for this purpose. And so when it happens through Persia, it's because God makes it happen through Persia. If the exile is not in God's hands, how can we be sure that the restoration will be? And if we want the promise of that restoration to be in God's hands, then we have to wrestle with the possibility, the reality, that the exile also was in God's hands. And what could that be about? But some combination of reprimand and re-education about the ways in which we have not lived up to God's calling as God's people. And so we see in the two Psalms that we're reading here relative to exile and restoration, that the psalmist in Psalm 137 commits the anger at Edom and Babylon and their cruelty and the way in which they exiled Judah in the early 6th century. The psalmist commits that anger to God in a prayer that God will bring judgment on Babylon and Edom. And indeed, in Psalm 126, in the moment of restoration, when God restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like dreamers, seeing that dream of God's promised restoration come true, one that could be counted on because God's hand is in all of this. When we come to the New Testament, we see that it is primarily this image of the shepherd that the New Testament writers pick up on. When Ezekiel in chapter 34 has said, because the shepherds of Israel have failed the people, Therefore, God will personally shepherd the people. And so, right off the bat in Matthew 2, when the Magi come from the east and inquire about the birth of a new king of the Jews, and Herod hears about it, much to his consternation, because this would be a political threat. Herod asks those in the court who would know these things, his personal Google, if you will. He says, "Where is this king of the Jews to be born?" And they say, "It has to be in Bethlehem." In Micah 5:2 and 2 Samuel 5:2 indicate that the Messiah, the anointed ideal king, the future one who will lead Israel properly. Both of these texts, which are kind of mashed up in Matthew 2, verse 6, both of them indicate that this figure will be born in Bethlehem. And that the figure will be born there in order to shepherd God's people. The gospel writer Luke in chapter 15 has Jesus tell a parable right at the opening of the chapter, verses 3 to 7, about a lost sheep. How many of you, if you have 100 sheep and one gets lost, go out and search for that sheep? And so Jesus says this is how God responds to the sheep of God's flock, of God's people. Mark in chapter 6 has already said that Jesus, when he taught the crowds in advance of the great feeding, noticed that they were like sheep without a shepherd. And so he began to teach them. Matthew in chapter 15 says to the Canaanite woman, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And earlier in Matthew 10, sent out the disciples, telling them to go nowhere among the other peoples of the area, the Gentiles, but only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So this image of the good shepherd gets picked up by the gospel writers, by the New Testament writers, and used in relationship to Jesus as the one who comes as the presence of God to lead and guide and care for the people the way that a ruler should. And of course, this comes to its fullest expression, its richest expression in the 10th chapter of John's Gospel, where Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd. The sheep hear my voice. I know my sheep and they know me." And so it gets elaborated into this rich imagery of Jesus as the shepherd, typically portrayed in the agricultural image, right? In that kind of pastoral image of Jesus with the sheep around his shoulders for the lost sheep, or Jesus with a whole flock and the shepherd's crook. Shepherd's crook was actually a symbol within Egyptian hieroglyphs for one of the kings. We see it also in Mesopotamian iconography, that the shepherd's crook is a symbol of royalty. We don't often think of it that way, and I've heard plenty of sermons, probably preached one or two myself, I'm sure you have as well, where this image of the shepherd is really restricted to its countryside farming and herding context in order to try to learn something about who God is. There's nothing wrong about that, but it's limited because in its context, to be the good shepherd in these cultures also meant to rule well and in the interests of the people and not one's own power. And why does the New Testament talk about Jesus as a good shepherd? Because for these writers, the people of God in the church, the people of God gathered around the figure of Jesus, are themselves still in exile. In a letter that's probably written pretty contemporarily with the gospel writers, between 70 and 90 of that first century of the Common Era. The first letter of Peter uses this image of exile most explicitly, without particularly referring to the shepherd imagery. But in its opening, the letter writer, who is apparently situated in Rome, addresses the exiles who are in 5 urban centers scattered across Asia Minor, what we now know as Turkey, and addresses those exiles as those who are in the diaspora. They've been scattered, they've been spread out to where they are. At the end of the letter writer says that this letter is being written from Babylon, with greetings from others who are with me in Babylon. This letter writer wasn't in Babylon at all. This letter writer was in Rome. But the memory of the exile shapes the understanding of Rome as the powerful political force that determines the daily lives of God's people. The memory of exile shapes the perception of Rome around this figure of Babylon. The writer of the book of Revelation uses the same imagery for Rome. And in chapter 2 of this first letter of Peter, in verses 11 and 12, there's something of an exhortation, a lesson, a teaching about if we live in exile, because we are not in God's kingdom fully. We do not see the Good Shepherd on the throne in Rome. We are living among a people who do not recognize Jesus or God as the Good Shepherd. So if we live here in exile, how shall we live as God's people? The author of this first letter of Peter says, live so that God's name, God's figure, God's image is honored, revered, respected by those around you, even those who do not worship God. Do nothing that would bring shame on God because of what people see God's people doing. Exile and restoration. Realities that probably shape our lives on a daily basis, times when we feel alienated from God and from our community, from our culture, times when we feel that God has placed us exactly where we are and is fully with us, and we're able to live our lives to their greatest capacity in God because of the blessing that God has given in restoring us, whether it's from ill health, whether it's from bad relationships, whether it's from difficult economic times, whatever it might be that has driven us out of the place where we feel at home. The time comes when God's promise is fulfilled and we are restored. I look forward to our conversation. God bless.